August 27th, 1979. Mullaghmore, County Sligo. A fishing village on Ireland's Atlantic coast where the summer light comes in long and flat off the water, and where Lord Louis Mountbatten had been coming every August for longer than most of the locals could remember. He walked down to the pier that morning the way he always did. The harbour was quiet. The sky was clear. County Sligo in late August, the last warmth of the season sitting over the bay. Classiebawn Castle stood on its headland behind him, a Victorian-Baronial pile spectacularly positioned on a bare promontory above the Atlantic, all turrets and views, exposed on three sides to the open sea and everything that came off it. Lord Mountbatten was 79 years old. He was also, by any accounting, the most decorated living representative of the British establishment. He had been first Earl Mountbatten of Burma, Admiral of the Fleet, Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia, last Viceroy of India, first Sea Lord, the highest naval post in the country, Chief of the Defence Staff, the man who had presided over the formal dissolution of Britain's largest colonial possession. If you drew a diagram of British imperial authority in the 20th century and placed its most visible single human symbol at the center, that symbol had spent 62 years becoming unmistakably, inescapably, the name Mountbatten. His fishing boat was named Shadow V. His 14-year-old grandson Nicholas Knatchbull was with him that morning, the summer holiday winding down. Paul Maxwell, 15, from Enniskillen, hired as the boatboy for the season, was aboard too. Maxwell had spent his summer alongside Lord Mountbatten's grandsons and had, by accounts of people who knew him, become genuinely fond of the family beyond the terms of employment. The Dowager Lady Brabourne, 83 years old and Nicholas's paternal grandmother, completed the party. The bomb was already in the hull. Thomas McMahon had placed it there the night before. A carpenter from Carrickmacross in County Monaghan, he was also one of the IRA's senior explosives officers in South County Armagh. He had come to Mullaghmore harbour in the dark hours of August 26th, boarded Shadow 5, where she sat moored and unguarded, and packed 50 pounds of gelignite into the boat's structure, wiring it to a radio-controlled detonator. Then he left. The morning was already turning bright. Multiple warnings had reached Mountbatten that year. Intelligence assessments identified an IRA operation targeting members of the royal family, with Mountbatten as the probable primary target. A third source communicated that an assassination plot existed, aimed directly at him, and that going to Ireland that summer wasn't advisable. When these warnings were relayed, Mountbatten reportedly asked what the IRA could possibly want with an old man. He refused Garda officers aboard the boat. He declined an escort. He had employed 12 guards at Classiebawn Castle back in 1971, when the security situation first became clearly untenable, and 28 by 1974, but the boat remained an exception, a private space beyond the reach of institutional caution, or at least beyond his willingness to let it intrude. At approximately 11:45 that morning, as Shadow 5 moved out of Mullaghmore harbour into the bay, the detonation signal came from the shore. The explosion lifted the boat clean out of the water and destroyed it completely. Lord Mountbatten was killed instantly. Nicholas Knatchbull, 14 years old, was killed instantly. Paul Maxwell, 15, was killed instantly. The Dowager Lady Brabourne died from her blast injuries the following day. Nicholas's twin brother Timothy and his parents, Lord Brabourne and Patricia Mountbatten, survived, badly injured, pulled from the wreckage in water gone suddenly violent and full of wreckage. 5 hours later, the IRA detonated a 1,100-pound bomb packed into milk churns at Warren Point. A second device followed. 18 British soldiers died, the single deadliest attack on the British Army during the entire Troubles. Both operations on the same calendar date, coordinated, designed for maximum institutional impact on a single day. This wasn't improvisation. It was a campaign. The IRA's official statement described Lord Mountbatten as a symbol of all that is Imperial Britain. It called the assassination one of the discriminate ways we can bring to the attention of the English people the continuing occupation of our country. No list of titles, no enumeration of his specific crimes or acts. A symbol. The name itself. The name was Mountbatten. It was 62 years old. It had been manufactured, deliberately and consciously, by a man who believed a well-chosen name could protect a family from exactly this kind of violence. He was right, for 62 years. Then it did the opposite. To understand the 1979 bomb, you have to understand the 1914 resignation. They are the same story, told twice with different weapons. Prince Louis of Battenberg was born in Graz, Austria, in 1854, the son of Prince Alexander of Hesse and a Polish countess named Julia von Hock. Her title, Countess of Battenberg, granted in 1851 by Grand Duke Louis III of Hesse, elevated to Princess of Battenberg in 1858, derived from a town in the German state of Hesse. The Battenberg name was a morganatic creation, generated by a marriage considered below royal rank and compensated with a title as consolation. It was 57 years old when Prince Louis anglicized it. The family had always known it was operating on shallower foundations than the dynasties it moved alongside, and had always compensated for that with demonstrated personal achievement rather than the assumption of inherited authority. Prince Louis naturalized as a British subject in 1868, aged 14, and joined the Royal Navy that same year. 44 years of service followed, a career that earned its distinction methodically, rank by rank, posting by posting, across half a century of the Victorian and Edwardian Navy. By the time he reached the top, he had more operational experience than almost anyone in the senior service. In 1912, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, appointed him First Sea Lord, the highest post the Royal Navy could offer. Contemporary assessments describe him as a competent and serious officer who spent substantial energy moderating Churchill's more aggressive strategic impulses once hostilities began. The war began in August 1914. Germany was the enemy. Prince Louis of Battenberg was the first Sea Lord of the Royal Navy. He had a German name. And in Britain, during the autumn of 1914, a German name was sufficient grounds for public attack, regardless of anything else about you. The press campaign that followed lasted 11 weeks. It wasn't subtle. Newspapers accused Prince Louis of German sympathies, of divided loyalty, of covert sabotage, of being constitutionally unfit to hold the nation's highest naval command. The specific accusations were fabricated. The underlying logic was simple and vicious. He sounded German, therefore he was suspect, therefore he had to go. Anti-German hysteria had real physical force in Britain that year. Businesses with Germanic names had their windows smashed. People with German surnames found themselves publicly denounced. The cultural violence that comes with wartime nationalism was running at full pressure across the country. Prince Louis was the most visible German-named figure in British military authority. He was the obvious focal point, the clearest available target. King George V opposed the resignation. The king tried to prevent it, understood the injustice of it, and found that public sentiment was simply more powerful than royal objection. The press campaign had created a political reality that overrode institutional loyalty. On October 29, 1914, With the war 11 weeks old and his 44-year career in ruins behind him, Prince Louis submitted his letter. He wrote, "I have lately been driven to the painful conclusion that at this juncture my birth and parentage have the effect of impairing, in some respects, my usefulness on the board of the Admiralty. Not incompetence, not disloyalty, not professional failure of any kind. His birth and parentage. The name Battenberg, 44 years of service, ended in 11 weeks by a public mood and a German-sounding surname. He was 59 years old. He retired to the Isle of Wight. The government promised he would be recalled after the war. That promise was never honored. He sat with what remained of his career and what remained of his name, and he is said to have never recovered from the wound the resignation made. The irony had a specific shape that would have been difficult to miss. The man who had appointed him First Sea Lord, who had placed him at the summit of British Naval Command and worked closely with him in the opening weeks of the war, was the same man who ultimately accepted his resignation under public pressure. Winston Churchill gave Prince Louis the highest post the Navy could offer, and then surrendered that appointment to a newspaper campaign. Churchill would return to this story, in 1952, from the other direction. Prince Louis spent 3 years on the Isle of Wight before a king asked him to choose a new name. By 1917, the anti-German problem had expanded from press campaigns targeting individuals into a genuine constitutional crisis for the royal family itself. The dynastic name was Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. German nomenclature accumulated through generations of strategic marriages across the ruling houses of Europe. George V and Kaiser Wilhelm II were first cousins. Persistent public rumors were circulating with increasing volume. How could the royal family be genuinely opposed to Germany when their family name was German, their ancestry was German, their relatives were German? 3 years into the war, with industrial unrest at home, the Russian February Revolution demonstrating what could happen to a monarchy that lost the confidence of its population, and the public mood more volatile than it had been since the war's beginning, the palace had a problem it could no longer defer. Lord Stamfordham, the king's private secretary, had been studying the question. His recommendation was comprehensive: a coordinated renaming exercise that would formally and publicly sever the connection between the British monarchy and its German past, extended simultaneously to the German-named aristocratic families in the royal orbit. The exercise was propaganda in the most precise sense. It was designed to reshape public perception of an institution whose survival depended on that perception. George V's proclamation of July 17, 1917, wasn't a spontaneous act of sentiment. It was a calculated political maneuver, and Stamfordham was its architect. On July 17, 1917, George V proclaimed the House of Windsor. Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was abolished by royal declaration. At the king's direct request, the Battenberg family relinquished their German titles and styles on July 14th, formally adopting the anglicized surname. 3 days later, Prince Louis was created first Marquis of Milford Haven by letters patent. The Tech family became Cambridge. Prince Alexander of Battenberg, son of the late Prince Henry, was created first Marquis of Carisbrooke by letters patent dated July 18th. The Titles Deprivation Act 1917 ran alongside the renaming exercise as its enforcement mechanism, stripping enemy alien titles from those who had fought against Britain. The punishment to accompany the reinvention. The same legislative session that gave the royal family its English name removed German titles from those who had actively refused to perform Britishness. Now, which English name for the Battenbergs? 2 translations of the German original were on the table. Berg means mountain in German, phonetically anglicized Battenberg could become either Batten Hill or Mountbatten. Both translations were technically defensible. The University of Southampton's Special Collections, holding the family's documentary archive, records the deliberateness of the choice. The family adopted the name Mountbatten, an anglicization of the German Battenberg, rejecting the alternative translation of Batten Hill. Batten Hill was serviceable. It was also provincial. It sounded like a village in the outer suburbs of a medium-sized city, like something you'd find on an estate agent's board, rather than on an aristocratic letterhead. Mountbatten had entirely different resonance. It carried the weight of altitude, the suggestion of geological permanence, a name that sounded like it had been settled into the British landscape across centuries of use, rather than assigned at a civil servant's desk on a Tuesday afternoon in wartime. The choice of Mountbatten over Batten Hill was a choice about what the name was supposed to perform, not merely to disguise a German origin, but to manufacture the impression of long-established British identity, to give the family a foundation they could build upon, rather than simply a hiding place. Prince Louis received the Marquisate of Milford Haven and a seat on the Privy Council, the king's public gesture of personal support for a man who had been treated unjustly, and was being asked to absorb a further erasure for the benefit of the broader exercise. The peerage compensated him without restoring him. He had a new title and a new name, and the naval career that had justified both was still 3 years past its forced end. He died in London on September 11th, 1921. He had 4 years with the new name, long enough to watch it settle into British aristocratic usage without obvious friction, long enough to see his younger son Dickie established in a naval career, long enough to understand that the invention had worked in its most basic sense. He had not seen what Dickie intended to do with it. His son had been watching every moment of this, from his father's forced resignation at age 14 to the name change at 17, and he had drawn conclusions. Lord Louis Dickie Mountbatten was born June 25, 1900, as Prince Louis of Battenberg, the name he would carry for the first 17 years of his life before it was changed at the king's request. He grew up understanding, with a directness that shaped everything that followed, exactly what a name could cost. His father's 44-year career had been ended not by professional failure, but by a press campaign about a surname. The lesson Dickie took from that was specific and operational. A name without deep roots was permanently vulnerable to exactly this kind of attack unless it was elevated to a level of prestige that made attacking it institutionally untenable. A name that was only a name could be taken. A name that had accumulated enough symbolic weight to represent something larger than a single family, that was a different proposition. He had the personality for this project in ways his father had not. Prince Louis had been a serious, professionally driven naval officer who regarded his achievements as justification enough for his position. Dickie was something else. Biographers across the political spectrum, sympathetic and hostile alike, converge on certain qualities with unusual consistency. He was a man of extravagant ambition who made no real effort to disguise it. He leveraged his royal connections without apology and pursued the advancement of his career and reputation with a systematic energy that contemporaries found distinctly un-English. He tried, one contemporary noted, just that little bit too hard. And he made it too obvious. He acknowledged this quality himself, describing his own vanity as consummate, in a moment of unusual self-awareness. "I believe firmly that it was the Almighty's goodness to check my consummate vanity." The remark reads like a man filing a complaint while ostensibly expressing gratitude. What the name needed first was money. The Mountbatten brand required operation at the level of established British aristocracy. Broadlands, the Hampshire social calendar, the visible lifestyle of a family that belonged at the center of national life. And a naval officer's salary couldn't sustain that at the required scale. On July 18, 1922, Dicky married Edwina Ashley, and that structural problem was solved. Edwina was the granddaughter of Sir Ernest Cassell, the financier whose wealth was of a scale that made vast feel like understatement. Cassell's estate included Broadlands, a large Palladian house in Hampshire, and properties and investments accumulated across decades at the top of the Edwardian financial world. The Cassell fortune passed to Edwina, who was, by every account, considerably more than a financial solution. She was quick, independent, politically engaged, and capable of operating at whatever level of public life she chose entirely on her own terms. Her daughter Pamela's memoir describes her as having inherited beauty, brains, and wealth from the Cassell line, and all three were observable in how she moved through the world. What the inheritance provided, materially, was the infrastructure the Mountbatten name required. Broadlands functioned as the social headquarters, a house prestigious enough to host, among other occasions, the honeymoon of Princess Elizabeth and Philip Mountbatten in November 1947. The castle money meant the Mountbatten name could be maintained at the level of visibility and social engagement that Dicky believed was necessary for it to accumulate the kind of prestige that would protect it from the kind of attack that had destroyed his father's career. Edwina funded this project for 38 years, and her contribution to what the Mountbatten name became is difficult to overstate. During the 1947 partition of India, where Dicky served as the last viceroy, Edwina developed a close and well-documented relationship with Jawaharlal Nehru. Letters survive, including one Nehru wrote to Edwina's daughter Pamela in later years. She continued her own independent work through humanitarian organizations after India, traveling, inspecting, representing, exactly the kind of institutional service that a name like Mountbatten required its bearers to perform in order to justify itself. On February 21, 1960, she died in her sleep in Borneo on an official Far East inspection tour. She was 58, still working, still fulfilling the obligations the name carried with it. The financial and social architecture she had provided the Mountbatten brand outlasted her by 19 years. Dicky's career was, looked at from a certain angle, a systematic rehabilitation of everything his father had been denied. He returned to the First Sea Lord's office, the precise post from which Prince Louis had been driven in October 1914, and held it from 1955 to 1959. The son reclaiming what the mob had taken from the father, 41 years later. The ledger corrected, or at least partially corrected, by demonstrated achievement in the interim. He had served as Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia during the Second World War, attaching the Mountbatten name to a global military command at the defining moment of the century. In 1947, last Viceroy, the administration of the formal end of the British Empire's largest possession, conducted under the Mountbatten name, with all the historical weight that event would carry permanently afterward. Then Chief of the Defence Staff, the highest uniformed position in the British military, the ultimate institutional acknowledgement that the name had arrived. Each posting was another layer of authority applied to a name that had been manufactured 30 years earlier in a wartime emergency. By the mid-1950s, Mountbatten didn't sound like a 1917 translation of a Hessian town's name. It sounded like a dynasty. It carried the weight of military history, of colonial governance, of royal proximity, of everything that constituted the establishment's self-understanding in the post-war period. That accumulation of meaning was entirely intentional. Dicky had built it piece by piece, with the focused attention of someone who understood from childhood that a name without deep roots had to earn its place constantly, actively, publicly, or it would be taken. His management of his own historical legacy was equally systematic. He engaged with cinema and television projects about his career, shaped narratives about his own life for public consumption, and cultivated his connection to the royal family through matchmaking as much as through military service. His engineering of the marriage between his nephew Philip and Princess Elizabeth is acknowledged across multiple accounts of the period. Philip's cultivation of the future queen during his naval years appears, in secondary sources, as having been guided at least partly by Dickie's strategic interest in where that relationship could lead. He was described by contemporaries as that incorrigible royal matchmaker in relation to Philip and Elizabeth, and the match succeeded. By the time George VI died in February 1952 and Elizabeth acceded, the Mountbatten name was inside the palace, attached to the consort of the new queen. And Dickie considered the arithmetic obvious. At a party shortly after the accession, he reportedly told his assembled guests that the House of Mountbatten now reigned. He said it as an announcement. Winston Churchill was re-elected Prime Minister in October 1951 and was 4 months into his second term when Elizabeth became Queen. He understood immediately what Mountbatten was attempting, and he understood it not merely as personal overreach, but as an institutional threat. The opposition assembled around Churchill with notable speed. Queen Mary, the widow of George V, and Lord Beaverbrook, the press baron. Churchill and Beaverbrook characterized the push directly as a Mountbatten family attempt to capture the British dynastic succession. Queen Mary brought a different dimension to her opposition. She was the woman who had been present at the creation of the Windsor name in July 1917, who understood its purpose as a survival mechanism and its authority as something George V had deliberately manufactured and deliberately protected. And she wasn't prepared to see it replaced by the name of her daughter-in-law's consort's relatives. One source notes she brought didactic energy to the argument, treating the moment as an occasion to establish a principle beyond the immediate dispute. Churchill's structural objection was about age and legitimate authority. The Windsor name had been proclaimed on July 17, 1917. The Mountbatten name had been adopted on July 14, 1917. They were the same age, 35 years old in 1952, both created in the same fortnight, both products of the same wartime political emergency. Windsor had been created to serve the monarchy's continuity. Mountbatten had been created to serve a family's social survival. Those weren't equivalent claims on the right to name a dynasty. The prestige that Dickie had accumulated for the Mountbatten name was, from Churchill's perspective, precisely what made it dangerous, not what entitled it to replace Windsor. A name 35 years old, however brilliantly managed, couldn't inherit the legitimacy of the world's oldest continuous monarchy from a name also 35 years old. The entire enterprise of the British monarchy depended on continuity appearing natural and institutional, rather than managed and adjusted. Windsor, whatever its actual recent origins, had been embedded for 35 years into a period of extraordinary national history. 2 world wars, the end of empire, the death of a king, the coronation of a new queen. Mountbatten had accumulated personal prestige. Windsor had accumulated institutional weight. They weren't interchangeable. On April 9, 1952, Queen Elizabeth issued the Declaration. The London Gazette, issue 41,948, recorded the exact wording. Whereas on the 9th day of April 1952, I did declare in council my will and pleasure that I and my children shall be styled and known as of the house and family of Windsor. 30 years of deliberate construction. 1 sentence in the London Gazette. Philip's reaction has been recorded in 2 versions, and both are worth giving in full, because both capture different dimensions of the same injury. The first: I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children. The second, from multiple secondary accounts: I am nothing but a bloody amoeba. He had surrendered his Greek and Danish royal titles, naturalized, taken the Mountbatten name as his own British identity, married into the direct line of succession, and watched the name that had bought him entry into the institution he now served daily be declined at the door to the dynasty's interior. The name had gotten him in. It had gotten him as far in as any name could take a man. And then the institution had declined to wear it. 8 years later, on February 8, 1960, an order in council offered what the royal household evidently considered a satisfactory compromise. Descendants of the Queen who held no HRH status and no princely titles would bear the surname Mountbatten Windsor. Not the house. The house remained Windsor. Not the titled members. Those continued as Windsor. The Mountbatten portion of the hyphenation was allocated specifically to those members of the family with the least institutional power. The untitled branch, the people furthest from the throne, the ones for whom the name carried the least political consequence. Debrett's, which has the final word on such matters, records it in flat technical prose, other than those entitled to the style HRH or Royal Highness, which is another way of saying everyone the name had been built to reach. The House of Mountbatten was never declared. The compromise acknowledged the name's existence. It surrendered nothing that mattered. Philip had been offered a hyphen. By the summer of 1979, Lord Mountbatten was the last major carrier of what the name had become. Edwina was dead, 19 years in her grave. The house name battle was settled history, filed and hyphenated and done. Philip had served the institution for nearly 3 decades under a name arrangement that kept his surname off the dynasty. The Mountbatten brand ran on accumulated prestige and the institutional inertia of 6 decades of very deliberate construction. And every August, Dickie went to Classiebawn. The castle sat on its County Sligo headland in a location that was, from a security perspective, about as exposed as a target could be. It was in the Republic of Ireland, outside British jurisdiction, outside UK security protocols, in a country where the IRA operated with a degree of freedom unavailable to them north of the border. The approach from the sea was open. The village of Mullaghmore was small, the harbour compact and unremarkable, and the presence of a famous elderly British aristocrat was local knowledge in the same way any seasonal resident becomes local knowledge in a place that small. The security numbers tell the story of a man who understood the threat intellectually and refused it emotionally. 12 guards at Classiebawn in 1971. 28 by 1974. The escalation tracks the escalation of IRA capability and intent during the Trouble's most violent years. The guards were at the castle. The boat was another matter. In 1979, the warnings were unusually specific. Multiple sources communicated that British intelligence had information about an IRA plan targeting members of the royal family, and that Mountbatten was the probable primary target. A third source made the operational detail explicit. There was a plot, it was aimed at him, and traveling to Ireland that summer was dangerous. When these were conveyed, he reportedly asked what the IRA could possibly want with an old man. The category error was complete. The IRA wasn't interested in an old man. They were interested in a symbol, and in the summer of 1979, no symbol of British imperial authority was more legible, more concentrated, or more physically accessible than the Earl Mountbatten of Burma sitting on a fishing boat in an Irish harbour with no police protection. The difference between his personal vulnerability and his symbolic value had collapsed to nothing. Thomas McMahon reached Mullaghmore on the night of August 26th. He knew the boat. He knew the harbour. He boarded Shadow 5 in the darkness, working methodically in the quiet of the moored vessel, and packed 50 pounds of gelignite into the hull. The detonator was wired to a radio-controlled unit, the kind of technology triggered remotely from the shore without requiring the operator to be aboard or even nearby when the device fired. McMahon left before the morning light changed over the bay. The forensic evidence that convicted him was specific in the way forensic evidence tends to be when someone has handled explosives and walked through the location they've targeted. Police investigators found nitroglycerin and ammonium nitrate residue on his clothing, paint flakes matching Shadow V's green and white hull on his boots and his jacket, sand from Mullaghmore Harbour in the treads of his boots, the physical record of a man who had been where he claimed he hadn't been. He was convicted on November 23, 1979, sentenced to life imprisonment, and released in 1998 under the Good Friday Agreement after serving 19 years. The morning of August 27th was clear over Mullaghmore, a beautiful day by the accounts of people who were there. Lord Mountbatten walked down to Shadow V. His grandson Nicholas, 14, was already there. Paul Maxwell, the boatboy, 15, a summer's acquaintance deepened into something warmer by months of daily proximity, was there. The Dowager Lady Brabourne, 83, completed the party. They moved out of Mullaghmore Harbour in the late morning sunshine at approximately 11:45. The signal came from the shore. The explosion lifted Shadow V completely out of the water. The boat was destroyed. Lord Mountbatten, Nicholas Knatchbull, and Paul Maxwell died instantly. The Dowager Lady Brabourne died from her injuries the following day. Nicholas's twin brother Timothy and his parents survived, dragged from wreckage and water still disturbed from the blast. The IRA's official statement was issued on September 1, 1979. The relevant sections deserve attention because they articulate, with unusual clarity, exactly what the operation was designed to accomplish. They called Mountbatten a symbol of all that is Imperial Britain. They described the bombing as one of the discriminate ways we can bring to the attention of the English people the continuing occupation of our country. They also noted that the death of Mountbatten and the tributes paid to him will be seen in sharp contrast to the apathy of the British government and the English people to our actions. 3 observations from that statement, taken together. A symbol, not an individual. A demonstration, not a grievance. A calculation about tributes and media attention, about the volume of institutional mourning that would follow the killing of someone who had been made over 6 decades into an irreplaceable symbol of the British establishment. That symbolic weight wasn't an accident of birth. It was the deliberate, systematic product of everything Dickie Mountbatten had spent his career constructing. Supreme Allied Commander, last Viceroy, First Sea Lord, Chief of the Defense Staff. Each title was another instrument in a long project of making the Mountbatten name mean something that couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be overlooked, couldn't be separated from the idea of British imperial authority itself. He had succeeded completely. The IRA's own statement is the most precise available assessment of how completely he had succeeded. The ceiling Churchill enforced in 1952 and the bomb the IRA planted in 1979 were consequences of the same quality, a name that had accumulated exactly as much symbolic weight as Dickie intended it to accumulate, concentrated precisely where he had intended to concentrate it. Churchill's objection had been that the name meant too much, too publicly, too obviously for an institution that needed its authority to seem ancient rather than managed. The IRA's logic was the inverse. The name meant exactly enough for a spectacular symbolic strike against the British establishment to land with maximum force. The name that Churchill wouldn't take into the royal house, and the name the IRA chose for its most symbolically ambitious assassination of the Troubles, were the same name. The ceiling and the bomb were the same verdict, arrived at from opposite directions. Paul Maxwell, 15 years old, had spent a summer working as a boatboy. He was from Enniskillen, Northern Ireland, and by accounts of people who knew him had become fond of the family he worked alongside. He had no name that was a symbol, no accumulated prestige, no institutional weight of any kind. He was on the boat because he had been hired for the summer by someone whose name had become, over 62 years of extremely deliberate management, impossible to be near without being near what it represented. Nicholas Knatchbull, 14, was Lord Mountbatten's grandson. His name was Knatchbull. He had no public role, no institutional symbolism, nothing the IRA statement could have cited as justification. He was there because his grandfather was there, and his grandfather was there because the name had made him into someone who kept returning to that harbor, to that boat, to that particular exposure, refusing, even in the face of specific intelligence, to allow the machinery of protection to interrupt the private life the name had never quite permitted him to live entirely privately. Go back to 1917. Prince Louis of Battenberg is 63 years old. He has been on the Isle of Wight for 3 years since the resignation that ended his career, and never stopped hurting. A king is asking him to choose an English name. The civil servants have identified 2 options, Battenhill and Mountbatten. He chose Mountbatten because it was the better tool. He was a practical man who had built a career on competence and professional judgment, and when presented with a practical choice, he made the better practical decision. Battenhill was adequate cover. Mountbatten was a foundation. It sounded like something that had earned its place in the British landscape through generations of presence, rather than being fabricated in a wartime emergency, which is exactly what it was, and exactly what both options equally were. But only one of them sounded otherwise. He chose the one that could become what he needed his children to be able to become. He received a marquisate and a seat on the Privy Council. He died in London on September 11th, 1921. He didn't see his son reclaim the first Sea Lord's office in 1955, the same post he had been driven from 41 years earlier. He didn't see the name arrive within one sentence in the London Gazette of becoming the name of the British Royal House. He didn't see his grandson by marriage sit in the palace and call himself a bloody amoeba. He didn't see the summer morning at Mullaghmore. But the name he chose between 2 options on a government form in July 1917 did all of those things. It bought the family back into the establishment at the precise moment when their German identity had made them a liability. It married itself into the succession. It pushed to the threshold of dynastic naming and settled, with the dignity of a hyphen, for the surnames of those who would never inherit the throne. It made Lord Louis Mountbatten into the most decorated and symbolically concentrated representative of British imperial authority in the latter half of the 20th century. And then it made him, precisely because of all of that, the most efficient available target on that clear Irish morning. Prince Louis had wanted to give his family a future. He succeeded, completely, extravagantly, beyond anything a man erasing his own name under wartime duress could have reasonably expected. The name manufactured to hide his family from hostility opened every door the British establishment owned. What he couldn't know, choosing between Battenhill and Mountbatten on a summer afternoon in 1917, was that a name powerful enough to open every door is also powerful enough to get you killed behind one of them. Subscribe for more stories like this.